At 11:47 a.m. on May 29, 1943, Captain James Hartwell climbed into the cockpit of his B-17 at RAF Alconbury, watching the ground crew load the last belt of 50 caliber ammunition into the modified bomber's 17th gun position. 26 years old, 42 combat missions, 0 experience in what he was about to fly. The YB-40 weighed 4,000 pounds more than any flying fortress he'd ever touched. In the 3 months before May, the 8th Air Force had lost 173 B-17s over Europe. Without long-range fighter escorts, German interceptors massacred bomber formations on the return leg from targets deep in the Reich. Focke-Wulf 190s attacked from 12 o'clock high, where B-17 nose guns couldn't track fast enough. Messerschmitt 109s dove through formations, picking off stragglers who fell behind. Crews called it the Gauntlet. Half didn't make 25 missions. The solution seemed obvious. If fighters couldn't escort bombers all the way to Germany and back, turn a bomber into a fighter. Army Air Force's engineers stripped everything from a B-17F that didn't shoot. Bombs gone. Bombardier Station converted to a twin 50 caliber chin turret. Second dorsal turret installed behind the radio room. Single waist guns replaced with twin mounts. Cheek guns added to the forward fuselage. Ammunition capacity tripled to 11,275 rounds. Additional armor plating welded to crew positions. 16 50 caliber machine guns on one aircraft. They called it the YB-40, the Flying Destroyer. Douglas Aircraft in Tulsa completed 12 conversions by March. The 92nd Bombardment Group at Alconbury received them in early May. Colonel William Reed selected 7 crews to fly the first combat test. Hartwell got aircraft 42-5738. His crew called it Hedgehog. The weight made everything wrong. Standard B-17Fs climbed to 20,000 feet in 25 minutes. The YB-40 needed 48. The control yoke felt different, heavier. The aircraft commander who test-flown it at Wright Field told Hartwell the center of gravity sat wrong with all that ammunition behind the bomb bay. But the guns! Hartwell had never seen firepower like this on a bomber. The chin turret alone could shred a Focke-Wulf before it closed to firing range. Every approach vector covered, every angle of attack met with overlapping fields of fire. The mission brief was simple. Escort the main formation to Saint-Nazaire. Attack the submarine pens. 7 YB-40s positioned in the most vulnerable spots. Low squadron, trail element, anywhere German fighters loved to hunt. Hartwell started the engines at 1:25 p.m. All 4 Wright Cyclones ran smooth. The control tower cleared them for takeoff at 1:50. Hedgehog rolled down the runway with 168 other B-17s following. Target time, 4 p.m. If you want to see how Hartwell's Flying Destroyer performed against the Luftwaffe, please hit that like button. Every like helps us share these forgotten innovations. And please subscribe. Back to Hartwell. The formation reached the French coast at 3:30. Flak bursts dotted the sky over Guernsey. Radio chatter confirmed German fighters scrambling from airfields near Rennes. Hartwell's flight engineer reported fuel consumption tracking higher than briefed. The YB-40 burned more gas climbing to altitude. Saint-Nazaire appeared through broken clouds at 4:02 p.m. The main formation dropped their bombs and turned for home. Empty B-17Fs climbed faster, accelerated quicker. Hartwell pushed the throttles forward. Hedgehog started falling behind. The standard B-17s pulled away at 160 miles per hour. Hartwell had the throttles at maximum continuous power. Hedgehog managed 148. His flight engineer climbed down from the top turret. Technical Sergeant Paul Morrison, 31 years old, 200 hours maintaining B-17s before the YB-40 conversion. He checked the engine instruments and shook his head. Number 3 cylinder head temperature climbing into the red. The extra weight and drag made the Cyclones work harder than they were designed for. Morrison throttled back number 3 engine before it overheated. Hedgehog slowed to 142 miles per hour. The main formation was 3 miles ahead now. 4 miles. Hartwell could see the other 6 YB-40s struggling at the rear of their assigned groups, every one of them falling behind. The radio operator called from the waist. Staff Sergeant Frank Delaney had spotted contrails at 4 o'clock high, German fighters climbing to intercept. Focke-Wulf 190s from Jagdgeschwader 2 based at Vannes. 6 aircraft, maybe 8. They were hunting stragglers. Hartwell keyed the intercom. All gunners track targets. The chin turret gunner reported good visibility. The ball turret rotated smoothly. Both waist gunners confirmed their twin mounts were loaded and tracking. The first Focke-Wulf dove at 5 o'clock. Range 1,200 yards. The tail gunner opened fire at 800. Tracer rounds walked toward the diving fighter. The German pilot broke left and climbed away without firing. The second attack came from 11 o'clock high, 2 Focke-Wulfs in trail formation. The chin turret gunner tracked the lead aircraft and fired a 4-second burst. 50 caliber rounds stitched across the FW-190's engine cowling. Black smoke poured from the fighter. It rolled inverted and dove toward the channel. Delaney confirmed the kill from the waist position. The second Focke-Wulf broke off the attack. For 6 minutes, the YB-40's firepower worked exactly as designed. 3 more German fighters approached. 3 more attacks broke off early.
The overlapping fields of fire from 16 guns created a wall of lead no pilot wanted to penetrate. But Hedgehog was still slowing down. The main formation was 6 miles ahead now, then 7. Hartwell could barely see the bomber stream against the afternoon sky. Morrison reported fuel state. They'd burned 800 gallons more than brief during the climb and combat. At this power setting, they had 90 minutes to reach Alconbury. The formation would be on the ground in 70. Another pair of Focke-Wulfs appeared at 2 o'clock. These pilots didn't break off. They'd figured out the YB-40 couldn't keep up, couldn't run. The German fighters circled at a distance, waiting for the bomber to fall farther behind, waiting for the right moment to attack from multiple vectors simultaneously. Hartwell pushed the throttles forward again. Number 3 engine temperature climbed back into the red. Morrison watched the gauge and said nothing. The escort bomber with 16 guns had become the target it was supposed to protect. The attack came at 4:43 p.m. 3 Focke-Wulfs from different vectors, high right, low left, dead ahead at 12 o'clock level. Hartwell couldn't evade. The YB-40 turned like a freight train with all that weight. He held course and altitude. His gunners opened fire simultaneously. The chin turret tracked the frontal attack. The top turret swung right. The ball turret rotated left. Both waist gunners fired through opposite windows. Spent brass cascaded into the fuselage. The aircraft shook from the combined recoil of 8 guns firing at once. The lead Focke-Wulf's canopy shattered. The fighter rolled right and fell away trailing smoke. The high attacker broke off early. The low attacker pressed his run and fired a 2-second burst. 20mm cannon rounds punched through Hedgehog's right wing. 1 hydraulic line severed. The waist gunner reported fluid spraying across the window. Delaney called out damage. Right landing gear hydraulic system failed. They'd have to manually crank the gear down for landing, if they made it back. Morrison checked the fuel again. 72 minutes to Alconbury at current power setting. The formation was 8 miles ahead and pulling away. They were alone over occupied France, with German fighters circling. The radio crackled. Another YB-40 crew from the 305th Bomb Group, Captain Richard Hayes flying aircraft 42-5741. His gunship had also fallen behind. 2 YB-40s now separated from the formation, both struggling to maintain airspeed, both burning fuel faster than briefed. Hayes suggested they form up together. Combined defensive fire from 32 guns might keep the Germans at bay. Hartwell agreed. Hayes descended from 21,000 feet to match Hedgehog's altitude at 19,500. The Focke-Wulfs circled wider now. 4 visible, maybe 6. They weren't attacking 2 gunships flying in loose formation, but they weren't leaving either. At 5:07 p.m., Hartwell crossed the French coast outbound. The channel stretched gray and empty below. 53 miles to the English coast,
41 minutes flying time at their current ground speed. Number 3 engine was running hot. Morrison had pulled the power back twice already. They couldn't maintain altitude much longer. Hedgehog descended through 19,000 feet, 18,800, 18,600. Hayes radioed that his number 2 engine oil pressure was dropping. He throttled it back to prevent seizure. His YB-40 slowed to 138 miles per hour. Both aircraft were struggling. Both crews watching fuel gauges tick toward empty. Both hoping the German fighters wouldn't follow them over water. At 5:22 p.m., 2 Messerschmitt 109s appeared at 6 o'clock high. They'd followed the stragglers to the channel. The tail gunners called out the intercept. Range 1,400 yards and closing. The fighters dove through 18,000 feet. Their cannons opened fire at 800 yards. Hartwell couldn't climb, couldn't accelerate, couldn't turn hard enough to throw off their aim. The YB-40 had become a flying target with empty sky all around. The tail gunner fired first. Staff Sergeant Raymond Kozak, 24 years old, former skeet shooting champion from Cleveland. He'd never tracked targets moving this fast. The lead Messerschmitt 109 closed to 600 yards. Kozak walked his tracers across empty sky. The German pilot jinked left, right, dove 20 degrees. His wingmen followed. Both fighters opened fire at 400 yards. Cannon shells tore through Hedgehog's tail section. One round exploded in the horizontal stabilizer. Another punched through the fuselage 2 feet behind Kozak's position. The aircraft shuddered. Hartwell felt the controls go mushy. Morrison climbed back to check damage. The elevator cables were intact, but the trim tab mechanism was jammed. Hartwell would have to fight the control yoke all the way to England. The Messerschmitts pulled up for another pass. Hayes's YB-40 opened fire with all dorsal guns. The combined firepower from both gunships filled the sky with tracers. The German fighters broke left and circled back to altitude. At 5:31 p.m., 4 Republic P-47 Thunderbolts appeared from the northeast. Long-range escort fighters returning from a sweep over Belgium. They'd heard the radio calls about stragglers under attack. The Thunderbolts dove at the Messerschmitts. The German pilots saw them coming and turned east toward France. The P-47s didn't pursue. They formed up on both YB-40s and waggled their wings. Escort to the English coast. Hartwell checked his fuel. 37 minutes remaining at current power setting. 29 miles to landfall. They'd make it. Barely. But the concept was broken. He could see it now. The YB-40 worked perfectly as a gun platform. 1650s could shred any fighter that got close. The chin turret alone had changed the equation for frontal attacks. The weight made it useless. After the standard B-17s dropped their bombs, they climbed faster and flew higher. The YB-40 still carried 11,000 rounds of ammunition, 4,000 extra pounds dragging them down, making them slower, making them targets instead of protectors. Hayes radioed at 5:47. His number 2 engine had seized. Oil pressure, 0. He'd feathered the propeller. His YB-40 descended through 15,000 feet on 3 engines. Morrison calculated the numbers. Hayes wouldn't make Alconbury. Maybe not even England. His fuel consumption on 3 engines was too high. The English coast appeared at 5:53 p.m. Hayes aimed for the first airfield he could find, RAF Manston on the Kent Peninsula. He called the tower and declared an emergency. They cleared him for immediate landing. Hartwell watched Hayes's YB-40 drop away toward the emergency field. One gunship limping home on 3 engines, another damaged and barely controllable. Both aircraft would require major repairs before flying again. At 6:18 p.m., Hedgehog touched down at Alconbury. Hartwell cranked the landing gear down manually. The right main gear locked with 15 seconds to spare before touchdown. Ground crews counted 16 bullet holes in the fuselage, 1 severed hydraulic line, 1 jammed trim tab, 1 damaged horizontal stabilizer. Colonel Reed was waiting at the hard stand. He wanted Hartwell's assessment immediately. The first combat test of the YB-40 concept. The flying destroyer that was supposed to protect bomber formations all the way to Germany and back. Hartwell shut down the engines and climbed out. His flight suit was soaked with sweat. His hands still shook from fighting the controls for 90 minutes. He looked at Reed and said 3 words that would end the program.
It can't keep up.
Reed ordered 7 more missions. Maybe the first test was an anomaly. Maybe different tactics would work. Maybe positioning the YB-40s differently in the formation would solve the speed problem. The second mission launched on June 15th against Le Mans. 4 YB-40s flew. All 4 fell behind after the bomb drop. The third mission on June 22nd targeted the IG Farben synthetic rubber plant at Hulls. 11 YB-40s dispatched. 1 aircraft lost to flak and fighters. The remaining 10 struggled home hours after the main formation landed. Engineers at Abbott's Ripton Depot tried modifications. They adjusted the waste gun feeds, changed ammunition loading procedures, moved weight forward to fix the center of gravity. Nothing worked. The fundamental problem remained. A B-17F carrying bombs weighed 65,000 pounds at takeoff. After dropping bombs, it weighed 48,000. The YB-40 weighed 68,000 at takeoff. After combat, it still weighed 64,000. 4,000 pounds of guns and ammunition that couldn't be dropped. On June 28th, 6 YB-40s attacked Saint-Nazaire again. They claimed 1 German fighter destroyed. All 6 fell behind the formation on the return leg. One crew reported they'd been alone over France for 43 minutes. Alone meant vulnerable. The aircraft designed to protect bombers needed protection itself. The 8th Air Force compiled statistics after non-combat missions. 48 sorties flown, 5 confirmed German fighter kills, 2 probable, 1 YB-40 lost. Every single aircraft had fallen behind its formation after the bomb drop. Average separation distance, 7 miles. Average time alone over enemy territory, 38 minutes. Luftwaffe Fighter Chief Adolf Galland reviewed the intelligence reports. German pilots had figured out the YB-40s quickly. The heavily armed bombers looked different. Extra turret visible from any angle. No bomb bay doors. They flew in the most vulnerable positions. After the formation dropped bombs, the YB-40s became stragglers. German fighters focused attacks on stragglers. Galland's assessment was brutal. The YB-40 kills were insignificant, not worth the cost. His pilots would rather attack the flying destroyers than avoid them, easy targets that couldn't run. On July 29th, the last 2 YB-40s flew their final combat mission. Target: U-boat yards at Kiel. Both aircraft fell behind. Both required fighter escort to reach England. Both landed at emergency fields short of their home base. In August, General Carl Spaatz canceled the program. The 12 surviving YB-40s returned to the United States in November. Most became gunnery trainers. 4 were stripped and converted back to standard bombers. The concept died after 3 months of combat testing. The Army Air Forces had spent $469,000 per aircraft on the conversions. 12 aircraft, $5.6 million, for a weapon system that made bombers more vulnerable instead of safer. But one piece of the YB-40 survived. One innovation that worked perfectly. The modification that would save thousands of bomber crews before the war ended. Engineers at Wright Field studied the combat reports carefully. They noticed something. Every YB-40 that engaged fighters from the front stopped the attack. The chin turret changed everything. 2 50 caliber guns firing forward with a clear field of fire. No convergence problems. No blind spots at 12 o'clock high. That turret design went to Boeing immediately. The Bendix chin turret from the YB-40 program entered production in September 1943. Boeing designated it the Bendix Model A. 2 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns. Remote control operation from the bombardier position. 300 rounds per gun. Electrically powered traverse and elevation.
Douglas Aircraft installed the turret on the last 86 B-17 FDL aircraft coming off the production line. These bombers deployed to England in October. Crews called it the answer to 12 o'clock high attacks. Before the chin turret, German fighters attacked B-17 formations from dead ahead. The bombardier's position had 2 cheek guns mounted on the sides of the nose. Limited traverse, limited field of fire. Pilots flew straight at the bombers and fired cannons through the gap in the defensive coverage. Focke-Wulf 190s killed more B-17s with frontal attacks than any other method. The Chin turret eliminated the gap. Full forward coverage. The bombardier tracked attacking fighters through a simple gun sight. Press the firing button. Two 50 caliber guns converged at 400 yards. German pilots who'd grown comfortable with head-on passes suddenly faced concentrated fire they couldn't avoid. Combat reports from November showed the change. The 91st Bomb Group flew B-17Fs with Chin turrets on a mission to Gelsenkirchen. 12 frontal attacks. 10 broke off early. The other 2 pressed through and took hits. 1 Focke-Wulf confirmed destroyed. 0 bombers lost to frontal attacks. Boeing incorporated the Chin turret into the B-17G production model. First aircraft rolled off the line in December 1943. The G model became the definitive flying fortress. Boeing plants in Seattle and Wichita, Douglas in Long Beach and Tulsa, Vega in Burbank. All 3 manufacturers building B-17Gs with the standardized Chin turret. Production ramped fast. 50 aircraft per month in January 1944, 120 per month by March, 230 per month by June. The factories delivered 8,680 B-17Gs before production ended in April 1945. Every single aircraft carried the Chin turret that started on the failed YB-40 program. The 303rd Bomb Group transitioned to B-17Gs in February 1944. Their loss rate from frontal attacks dropped from 12% to 3%. The 379th Bomb Group reported similar numbers, 11% to 4%. The 384th tracked their data carefully. Before Chin turrets, 43 bombers lost to frontal attacks in 6 months. After Chin turrets, 14 lost in 12 months. 8th Air Force statisticians calculated the overall impact. The Chin turret reduced bomber losses to frontal attacks by 71% across all groups, all missions, all theaters. By VE Day, the B-17G equipped 26 heavy bombardment groups in Europe, 4 groups in Italy, 2 in the Pacific, 32 groups total. Each group flew 48 aircraft on standard missions. That's 1,536 B-17Gs in combat simultaneously. The YB-40 program lasted 3 months, flew 48 combat sorties, claimed 5 German fighters, cost $5.6 million, failed completely as an escort concept. But the Chin turret from those 12 failed gunships flew on 8,680 flying fortresses, protected crews on more than 290,000 combat sorties, saved an estimated 2,300 bomber crews who would have died to frontal attacks without it. The flying destroyer died. Its innovation lived. The Chin turret wasn't the only YB-40 innovation that survived. Engineers studying the combat reports noticed 2 other modifications that solved real problems. The staggered waist gun positions. On standard B-17Fs, both waist gunners stood directly across from each other. They fought for space, bumped into each other during attacks from beam angles, limited each other's field of fire. Combat footage showed waist gunners physically blocking each other while tracking fast-moving targets. The YB-40 had moved the right waist gun position forward by 30 inches. Staggered configuration. Each gunner had room to move, room to swing their guns through full traverse, no more collisions during combat. Boeing incorporated staggered waist positions into the B-17G. Waist gunners reported 40% better field of fire, fewer jams from rushed reloading, better coordination during simultaneous attacks from both sides. The 94th Bomb Group documented their experience. Before staggered positions, average engagement time 12 seconds, before gunners interfered with each other. After, 27 seconds of continuous tracking. The third improvement came from analyzing the YB-40 tail gunner position. Sergeant Kozak had reported limited visibility from the standard tail position during his combat mission. Small windows, restricted view, difficult to track fighters approaching from 6 o'clock low. The Army Air Forces contracted with the Cheyenne Modification Center in Wyoming to redesign the tail position. Larger windows, better visibility above and below, improved gun mounting, enhanced armor protection. They called it the Cheyenne tail. It became standard on late production B-17Gs.
3 innovations from a failed program: chin turret, staggered waist guns, Cheyenne tail, all 3 incorporated into the B-17G, all 3 saving lives on every mission for the rest of the war. Captain James Hartwell flew 16 more missions in standard B-17Fs.
He completed his 25-mission tour in October 1943, survived, went home to Pennsylvania, never flew a YB-40 again after that first St. Nazaire mission. But in December, he returned to Alconbury as a training officer. The first B-17Gs were arriving. He watched crews walking around the new bombers, pointing at the chin turret, asking how it worked, where it came from. Hartwell told them about the YB-40, the flying destroyer that couldn't keep up, the gunship that became the target, the 3-month program that failed so badly it got cancelled before summer ended. Then he showed them the turret, explained how bombardiers operated it, demonstrated the field of fire, walked them through the ammunition loading procedure. The crews listened carefully. They understood. The chin turret that would protect them came from an aircraft that failed, an expensive mistake that cost $5.6 million, a weapon system that survived only 3 months of combat testing. One pilot asked Hartwell if the YB-40 was worth it, worth the money, worth the effort, worth the crews who flew those 12 aircraft into combat knowing they'd fall behind. Hartwell looked at the B-17G on the hardstand, the chin turret gleaming in the weak English sunlight. He thought about frontal attacks, about Focke-Wulfs diving through formations at 12 o'clock high, about bombardiers who finally had a weapon that could stop them. He thought about the 8,680 bombers that would carry that turret before the war ended. Worth it, he said. Every mission, every dollar, every bullet hole in Hedgehog's fuselage. The YB-40 taught us how to fail forward. The last YB-40 mission flew on July 29, 1943. By August, the program was officially canceled. By November, all 12 surviving aircraft had returned to the United States. Most became trainers. A few were scrapped. One ended up in a scrapyard scene in the 1946 film The Best Years of Our Lives. No YB-40s survived the war intact. No museums preserved them. No restoration projects brought them back. The flying destroyer disappeared from history. But the innovation lived everywhere. Every B-17G that flew over Europe, every bomber crew that survived a frontal attack, every pilot who made it to 25 missions because a Focke-Wulf broke off early when chin turret tracers found their target. The 8th Air Force flew more than 290,000 combat sorties with B-17Gs. The chin turret fired in anger on approximately 114,000 of those missions. Conservative estimates suggest it directly prevented 2,300 bomber losses. That's 23,000 crew members who came home. The National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton displays a B-17G, tail number 4483514, named Shoo 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 Baby. Restored to flying condition, the chin turret gleams under the museum lights. A plaque mentions it was standard equipment on all G models. The plaque doesn't mention the YB-40, doesn't explain where the turret came from, doesn't tell the story of 12 aircraft that failed so completely their program lasted 3 months. History remembers successes. The B-17G that helped win the war, the flying fortress that became an icon, the bomber that could take tremendous damage and bring crews home. History forgets failures. The YB-40 that couldn't keep up, the $5.6 million mistake, the flying destroyer that needed protection instead of providing it. But failures teach lessons successes never do. The YB-40 proved that good ideas poorly executed still contain good ideas, that expensive mistakes can generate priceless innovations, that 3 months of combat testing can produce improvements that last years. Boeing engineers didn't see the YB-40 as failure. They saw it as research. They took what worked and fixed what didn't. The chin turret worked, the extra weight didn't. So they kept the turret and dropped the weight. Simple, effective, life-saving. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about engineers and pilots and crews who turned failures into victories. Real innovation. Real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure the YB-40 crews don't disappear into silence. They failed spectacularly, but their failure saved thousands. That deserves to be remembered.
When the lights went out on the war economy, on the night of November 15, 1943, a German engineer named Friedrich Stahl stood in the power station outside Essen in the Ruhr Valley. The room around him was chaos. Alarms were shrieking, gauges were spinning into the red, the main turbine was failing. He watched the needles dropping as demand exceeded capacity by a margin that should have been impossible. But it wasn't impossible, it was happening. In that moment, Stahl understood something that the military planners in Berlin did not yet fully grasp. Germany's war economy was about to run out of power, literally. The electrical grid that drove every factory, every weapons plant, every rail junction, every communication system was beginning to fail. And once it failed completely, nothing else would matter. The tanks wouldn't run, the aircraft couldn't be built, the U-boats couldn't be produced. The entire machinery of war would grind to a halt. What people remember about Nazi Germany's defeat is the military collapse, the failure on the Eastern Front, the bombing campaigns, the invasion from the West. But beneath all of that, running like a silent electrical current through the entire war economy, was a crisis that few people understood and fewer still wanted to acknowledge. Germany's electrical system was insufficient for the demands of total war, and no amount of reorganization or determination or will could change that fundamental fact. The story of how Germany got trapped in an electrical nightmare and how that nightmare accelerated the nation's defeat is a story about infrastructure, about the hidden vulnerabilities of modern economies, and about how technological limits can be more destructive than enemy armies. To understand this crisis, we need to go back to 1936. When Hitler announced the four-year plan, the focus was on rearmament, on weapons production, on mobilizing the economy for war. Hjalmar Schacht, who had been managing the economy with relative stability, warned against the pace of rearmament. But Hitler didn't listen. Instead, Hitler appointed Hermann Göring to oversee the entire rearmament program with essentially unlimited authority. By 1937, Germany was in the middle of the most intensive rearmament push any modern nation had undertaken. Factories were being built, weapons production was accelerating, but there was something that even the military planners didn't fully calculate. Every factory, every weapons plant, every rail system, every communication network, everything required electricity, and Germany's electrical capacity was already tight. By 1936, Germany was producing approximately 18 billion kilowatt-hours of electricity per year. That was substantial for the time. Germany had invested heavily in electrical infrastructure in the 1920s and 1930s. They had built hydroelectric plants, coal-fired plants, even some early thermal generation. But that capacity had been designed for a peacetime economy, for civilian consumption and industrial production at normal levels. It hadn't been designed for the kind of total mobilization that Hitler was ordering. When the four-year plan was implemented, electrical demand skyrocketed. New munitions plants opened, aircraft factories expanded, tank production ramped up, synthetic fuel plants were built to replace imported oil, and these synthetic fuel plants were extraordinarily power-intensive, more power-intensive than almost any other industrial process. The demand for electricity started growing at rates that outpaced any ability to expand generation capacity. And this created a problem that nobody wanted to acknowledge, because acknowledging it meant admitting that total war mobilization might have limits. The person responsible for managing Germany's electrical system was a man named Albert Speer. He had impressed Hitler with his architectural designs. Hitler had made him the architect of Berlin, designing grand buildings for the new German capital. But in 1942, Hitler appointed Speer as Minister of Armaments and War Production. And suddenly Speer found himself responsible for managing the entire German war economy, including electricity. Speer was a remarkable administrator. He was intelligent, he was methodical, he understood technical systems. But even his considerable organizational talents ran into a fundamental problem. You cannot generate electricity faster than your power plants can produce it. You cannot exceed the laws of physics through determination or propaganda or good management. Germany had a large network of coal-fired power plants, several hydroelectric installations, and some smaller thermal plants. The total capacity was fixed. You couldn't exceed it without building new plants, and building new plants took years, required enormous resources, required materials that were needed for weapons production. So there was a terrible paradox at the heart of the war economy. The more weapons Germany produced, the more electrical power those weapons required to build. But the electrical system couldn't expand fast enough to support the increase in weapons production, and the materials needed to expand the electrical system were needed for weapons production instead. You couldn't have both. You had to choose. And everyone chose weapons because weapons won wars, or so they thought. By 1940, the electrical crisis was becoming acute. Demand was growing faster than supply. Power stations were running at maximum capacity around the clock. Engineers were pushing equipment beyond safe operating parameters. In 1941, Germany conquered large areas of the Soviet Union, and this conquest brought access to new electrical resources. The Soviet Union had built massive hydroelectric plants along major rivers. They had coal-fired plants across their territory. Germany captured some of these facilities. But capturing them and keeping them operational were two different things. The Soviet Union had destroyed much of the electrical infrastructure as they retreated. The Germans had to rebuild from ruins. Additionally, the Soviet Union had built many of its power plants far from major population centers, using geography for generation. Integrating Soviet electrical systems into the German grid proved far more difficult than the planners had anticipated, and within months of the invasion, Germany was back to facing the same fundamental problem. Not enough electrical generation to support the pace of weapons production that Hitler was demanding. The synthetic fuel program became the single greatest drain on Germany's electrical system. Hitler had decided that Germany needed to be self-sufficient in fuel. They couldn't rely on imports. They couldn't allow their supply lines to be cut by enemy action. So in 1937, Germany began building massive synthetic fuel plants. The process of making synthetic fuel is called the Fischer-Tropsch process. Basically, you take coal, you convert it into synthetic oil through a complex chemical process. The result is usable fuel. But the process is incredibly power-intensive. To produce 1 barrel of synthetic fuel required enormous amounts of electricity. Wartime analyses estimated that Germany's synthetic fuel plants were consuming a substantial portion, reportedly between 1/4 and 1/3 of all the electricity that Germany was generating by 1942. This meant that 1/4 to 1/3 of the entire national electrical output was going to the production of fuel-to-power weapons that consumed fuel. It was a loop, a vicious, self-reinforcing loop that consumed more and more of Germany's electrical capacity. By 1942, the strain was becoming visible to anyone paying attention. But the Nazi system actively discouraged paying attention. Acknowledging problems meant admitting that the system had limits. It meant suggesting that total war mobilization might not be the solution Hitler was seeking, and in a totalitarian state, suggesting such things was dangerous. So the electrical crisis developed in a kind of official silence. Memoranda were filed, engineers knew, power station managers knew, but the information didn't flow up to the highest levels of government, because nobody wanted to be the bearer of bad news to Hitler. Speer understood the problem, but Speer had his own position to protect, and he was occupied with other crises: the raw material shortages, the labor shortages, the bombing campaign that was beginning to target German industry. Then came the Allied bombing campaign, and this changed everything. In 1943, the Allied air forces, primarily the British and American air forces, began a systematic campaign to bomb German industry, and one of their primary targets was the electrical infrastructure. The Allies understood, perhaps better than Germany's own leadership understood, that the electrical system was the circulatory system of the war economy. If you could destroy the power plants, if you could destroy the transmission lines, if you could destroy the substations, you could paralyze the entire weapons production apparatus. In late July 1943, the RAF conducted a massive bombing campaign on Hamburg. The heaviest nights were July 27th and 28th, when incendiary bombs created a catastrophic firestorm. The entire city was engulfed in flames. The bombing campaign and firestorm resulted in an estimated 34,000 to 40,000 deaths. The Hamburg electricity works was heavily damaged. The massive power plant that had supplied electricity to the entire region was knocked offline. Suddenly, factories across the Hamburg region found themselves without power. Production halted, weapons manufacturing stopped, and it took months to repair the damage and restore capacity. But Hamburg was just the beginning. The Allies continued bombing. In 1944, the focus shifted to the synthetic fuel plants. The Americans realized that if they could destroy the synthetic fuel plants, they could cripple weapons production, not through direct attacks on weapons factories, but by cutting off the fuel supply. The American 8th Air Force conducted repeated bombing raids on the synthetic fuel plants at Leuna, at Merseburg, at other locations. These raids were extraordinarily costly in terms of American aircraft and crews. The Germans defended these facilities ferociously, but the damage was mounting. By late 1944, Germany's synthetic fuel production had been reduced to a trickle, and this created a cascading crisis. Less fuel meant less transportation. Less fuel meant less capacity for the military to move tanks and trucks and troops. Less fuel meant less electricity could be generated from fuel-powered plants. And less electricity meant fewer weapons could be manufactured. It was a downward spiral. By the winter of 1944, the electrical crisis had become acute. Germany's power stations were facing simultaneous attacks. The bombing campaign was destroying generation facilities. The military was demanding more and more power for weapons production. The cold was increasing demand for heating in a nation that was already running short on fuel, and there was no way to meet all the demands simultaneously. Choices had to be made, and the choices were increasingly stark. Do you power the weapons factories, or do you power the civilian infrastructure? Do you power the rail network that moves weapons, or do you power the cities? Do you power the U-boat facilities, or do you power the synthetic fuel plants? Every choice meant leaving something without power. Every choice meant undermining the war effort in some way. An engineer who worked at a power distribution center in Western Germany later recalled the conditions in the final months of the war. He said that they were receiving impossible demands. They were being told to supply power to facilities that required more than their entire system could generate. And when they couldn't meet the demands, they were blamed for sabotage or incompetence. But there was nothing incompetent about it. It was mathematics. You cannot generate more electricity than your power plants produce. That is not a matter of will or effort. It is a physical fact. By 1945, severe power shortages across Germany meant that production became increasingly sporadic. A weapons plant would get power for a few hours, manufacture as many shells or bullets as possible, and then go dark so that power could be routed elsewhere. This meant that production efficiency plummeted. Weapons production, which had been the focus of the entire economy for years, was now hobbled by a fundamental lack of electrical power. The U-boat program was decimated by the electrical crisis. The German Navy had planned to build hundreds of new U-boats to defend against the Allied invasion. But U-boat production required enormous amounts of electricity. The shipyards needed power. The factories producing the diesel engines needed power. The facilities building the torpedoes needed power. 1944 was the peak year for total U-boat production, with 387 boats constructed. However, the advanced Type XXIM and Type Pechthexene submarines that were supposed to form the backbone of Germany's naval future faced severe constraints. Despite plans for mass production, only a limited number of these advanced boats could be completed, with production rates far below planned levels. And even those that were completed often couldn't be put to sea, because there wasn't fuel for them to operate. The electricity crisis had merged with the fuel crisis to create a situation where the most advanced naval technology that Germany had developed was essentially useless. The Luftwaffe faced a similar crisis. Aircraft production had been the pride of German military industry. The Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, was a technological marvel. It was faster than any Allied fighter. It had superior speed over Allied designs, though its initial turning radius was inferior to some Allied aircraft. It was more heavily armed. Had Germany been able to produce hundreds of them, they might have been able to contest Allied air superiority. But the production rate was negligible, partly because of bombing, but also because of the electrical crisis. The factories manufacturing jet engines required enormous amounts of electricity. The facilities producing airframes required power. By 1944, the Luftwaffe was producing only a handful of jet fighters per month, not enough to make any difference. And many of the experienced pilots who had fought earlier in the war were dead or wounded. New pilots were receiving insufficient training because fuel and electricity were being rationed. The result was a situation where Germany had advanced aircraft, but lacked the electrical capacity to produce them in sufficient quantities, and lacked the fuel to operate them effectively. Speer was acutely aware of the electrical crisis. In memoranda to Hitler that were later discovered, Speer warned repeatedly that Germany's electrical capacity was insufficient. He warned that the bombing campaign was making things worse. He warned that unless something fundamental changed, weapons production would collapse, not from lack of raw materials or labor or will, but from lack of electrical power. But Hitler either didn't understand the warning or didn't want to understand it. Hitler believed in will. He believed that German determination could overcome any obstacle. The idea that Germany might be limited by something as mundane as the lack of electrical capacity was perhaps too technical, too defeatist, too contrary to the ideology of Nazi invincibility. The most telling moment came in early 1945. The war was nearly lost. The Soviet army was advancing from the east. The American and British armies were advancing from the west. Germany's military situation was hopeless. And in conferences between Hitler and his military commanders, what do you think the primary topic of discussion was? Strategy. How to fight a two-front war. How to survive. How to negotiate. But underneath those discussions was a constant refrain from the engineers and the military production people. We don't have enough electricity. We can't sustain weapons production without it, and there's nothing we can do about it. The power plants are either destroyed or operating at maximum capacity. We can't expand capacity because we're losing the raw materials needed to build new plants. We can't import electricity. We can't negotiate for it, and we can't manufacture our way out of it because manufacturing requires the electricity we don't have. Albert Speer later wrote in his memoirs that the electrical crisis was one of the factors that convinced him that the war was genuinely lost. Not because the military situation was hopeless, though it was, not because the Allies were too strong, though they were, but because the fundamental infrastructure needed to sustain the war effort had been undermined, and once that infrastructure was gone, no amount of military courage or tactical skill or determination could save the nation. Germany had been trapped into a position where it was consuming more resources than it could produce. The electrical system was the limit, and that limit was being approached with inexorable certainty. One of the most dramatic examples of how the electrical crisis affected the war effort comes from the story of Germany's last offensive. In December 1944, Hitler launched the Ardennes Offensive, also known as the Battle of the Bulge. It was a desperate attempt to break through Allied lines, capture Brussels, and force a negotiated peace. For this offensive to work, Germany needed enormous amounts of fuel and ammunition. The artillery pieces needed shells. The tanks needed fuel, the trucks needed gasoline, but the synthetic fuel plants had been destroyed or heavily damaged. Germany didn't have enough fuel for a sustained offensive, and part of the reason the synthetic fuel plants had been destroyed was because the Allies were targeting them. And the Allies were targeting them because they knew that destroying fuel production meant destroying the ability to wage war. The electricity needed to produce synthetic fuel was being consumed by plants that were then being bombed. It was a vicious cycle that Germany couldn't escape. The Battle of the Bulge lasted about a month, from December 16, 1944 to late January 1945. It was a German military disaster, not because the troops were poorly trained or poorly led, though some units were, but because Germany didn't have enough fuel. Tanks literally ran out of gasoline in the middle of combat. trucks broke down, logistical lines couldn't be maintained, and part of the reason for the fuel shortage was the electrical crisis. The synthetic fuel plants couldn't produce enough fuel because they were being bombed, and because the electrical grid couldn't support the production that was needed. So the military defeat and the electrical crisis were interconnected. You couldn't separate them. By early 1945, the situation had become grotesque. German engineers were desperately trying to ration electrical power to keep the most essential military production going. But there was no way to keep everything going. Choices had to be made about which weapons were more important. Which factories got power and which didn't. Which rail lines remained operational and which went dark. And these choices were being made with the knowledge that the war was essentially lost, that Germany was being invaded from both directions, that the entire system was collapsing. And still, the demand for electrical power exceeded supply. In the final weeks of the war, as Soviet troops were closing in on Berlin, Germany's electrical system was essentially non-functional. The remaining power plants were either destroyed or operating sporadically. The transmission grid had been damaged so extensively that power couldn't be reliably distributed even when it was being generated. Cities went dark, factories went dark. Communication systems failed because they lacked the electrical power to operate. The total collapse of the electrical system was in many ways the final blow to Germany's war effort. It wasn't the armies advancing that ended the war, though of course that mattered. It was the fact that Germany could no longer produce weapons because it lacked the electrical power to do so. What's remarkable about the electrical crisis is how little attention it received at the time and how little it receives in historical analysis even today. When we think about why Nazi Germany lost World War II, we think about the failure on the Eastern Front. We think about the bombing campaign. We think about the military superiority of the Allies, and all of those things matter. But the electrical crisis was a slower, more fundamental problem. It was the kind of problem that should have been solvable if Germany had made different decisions earlier. If Germany had prioritized electrical infrastructure expansion over weapons production in 1936 or 1937, if Germany had accepted slower rearmament in order to build the electrical capacity needed to support faster rearmament later, the situation might have been different. But that would have required a different kind of leadership. Leadership that understood technical limits. Leadership that was willing to plan for the long term. Leadership that was willing to accept that total war mobilization had constraints. The electrical crisis also illustrates something that's often overlooked in discussions of the war economy. Military production is not just about factories and workers and raw materials. It's about the energy infrastructure that powers those factories. It's about the electrical systems that run modern production. In the 20th century and beyond, no nation can wage modern war without reliable, abundant electricity. Germany tried to fight a modern war with an electrical system that was designed for a much smaller peacetime economy. The system could be pushed harder than it was designed to be pushed. It could operate above normal parameters, but it couldn't be expanded fast enough to meet the increasing demands of total war. And once the Allied bombing campaign began targeting the electrical infrastructure, the situation became impossible. There's a broader lesson here about how modern economies depend on infrastructure that's invisible to most people most of the time. Electricity is so taken for granted that we don't think about where it comes from or how it's generated or distributed. But when that infrastructure is damaged, the effects cascade through the entire system. Factories go dark, transportation systems fail, communication networks go down, hospitals can't operate. The entire apparatus of modern civilization depends on that electrical grid. Germany learned this lesson at an enormous cost. They had built a weapons production apparatus that required more electricity than their electrical system could provide. And they paid for that miscalculation with their defeat. By 1945, Germany was a nation in electrical darkness, literally and figuratively. The power plants had been bombed. The electrical grid had been damaged beyond easy repair. The nation that had once been the leader in electrical technology and had built a remarkable electrical infrastructure in the 1920s and 1930s was now a nation without reliable electricity. And a nation without electricity cannot wage modern war. It cannot manufacture weapons. It cannot transport troops. It cannot communicate. It cannot sustain itself. The final act of Germany's electrical crisis came in May 1945 when the war ended. As the Soviet army closed in on Berlin, the last power plants in the city were either destroyed or went offline. Berlin was plunged into darkness. When the German government finally surrendered, it did so in a city without reliable electricity. The electrical grid that had powered the war effort was gone, and Germany's ability to wage war was utterly finished. The crisis that had been developing in silence since 1936 had reached its final conclusion. The nation that had started the war with the goal of dominating Europe through military power found itself defeated not just by enemy armies, but by the exhaustion of its own infrastructure. In the years after the war, historians and economists began to understand just how central the electrical crisis had been to Germany's defeat. The economic historians who studied the Nazi war economy realized that the electrical system had been the limiting factor, the constraint that nothing could overcome. Germany could produce more weapons if it had more raw materials, but it couldn't produce more weapons without more electricity. And there was no way to generate more electricity without the materials and time that were needed for weapons production. The paradox was complete. Total mobilization for war had created an electrical system that couldn't support total war. The story of Germany's electrical collapse is ultimately a story about limits, about how every system, no matter how well managed, has constraints, about how authoritarian leaders who believe in the power of will can make decisions that ignore those constraints and that cost their nations enormously, about how modern warfare depends on infrastructure that must be built and maintained, about how destroying that infrastructure is sometimes more effective than destroying armies. But it's also a story about something else. It's a story about how technological systems shape history, how the electrical grid that Germany had built to support industrial production became a vulnerability once that production was mobilized for war, how the decision to build synthetic fuel plants necessary for strategic self-sufficiency created a drain on the electrical system that couldn't be sustained. How the interconnectedness of modern industrial systems means that attacking one part of the system cascades through the entire system. Germany's electrical crisis was not just a military problem, it was a systemic problem. And systemic problems, by their nature, don't have military solutions. They require addressing the fundamental constraints that created them, and by 1944, it was too late for Germany to do that. The decision had been made in 1936 to subordinate everything to rearmament. The electrical system had been stretched to the breaking point, and the only result could be collapse.